All right, I am going to record this for a couple of our folks that can't come. I know Chris just messaged me. He's out of town, and I don't know what's going on with the Wheelers. So without much further ado, I want to introduce to you guys Russ Cooper. He is a Wycliffe Bible translator, and it's really funny. When I first heard of him, it was when I was attending Ogilvy as a teenager. They had a board called the Cooper's Fund, and all I ever saw was the name Cooper, and nobody ever explained to me what it was for, but we would throw in some change. And then eventually it was my privilege to have a district extension class when he was back in the area, I believe taking care of his mother at the time. And he's been working on Bible translation, I believe, almost his entire adult life. So you want to introduce yourself a little, Russ, to everybody, and then we'll take him up.
He's fairly close on this, Dave is. I was born at that location where that he's talking about, Ogilvy in Michigan. And if you blink, you might see the corner, and if you don't blink, you'll end up in the swamp on one side and horse paddock on the other side. And 2 miles something down the road one way was a country store, and 2 or 3 miles down the road the other way was a country store. So it was a really big metropolis. I understand you have really big places out there too.
Yeah, we're getting a dollar store this year. It's pretty big news.
Wow. Well, Everett, when I was in my younger years, I think they had a drive-in and a Dairy Queen or something like that. And I was utterly surprised when my mom took me to McDonald's in Everett. They had really gone up in the world.
I'll share with that. I was a teenager when the McDonald's came in. It was the front page of our newspaper. It was a pretty big deal.
Well, now we don't even have a newspaper. It's a combined one with another place.
What is that, dollar store coming into Elkmar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Williams
wow.
getting one too.
Oh, you guys are coming up in the world. Woo!
Yeah.
Anyway, when I went overseas, I don't know what your terrain is, if you've got hills or flat. Whoops, I lost my view of everybody. Just a second here. If you've got hills or flat country or a combination of both, but Dave and Courtney can remember that we had one blacktop connecting an east-west highway at Everett and another blacktop, which was a highway angling down from another town, and eventually they merged and so forth. And then the rest of the roads were dirt roads. And if you got out a mile or so from the dirt roads, then they were 2 tracks in the woods. And when I got to Papua New Guinea, I said, I feel right at home. This is exactly like my home place, except that you have palm trees and we had pine trees. So we'll talk about Papua New Guinea, which is where I worked after a little bit. But I say to this day that my time at that Ogilvy church was preparing me to go back to the bush overseas. Okay. Dave and I talked about a few different things, and I don't know exactly what all will get done this session, and we might have another session or two afterwards. But I'm going to start out with a couple questions. And I don't know if Pastor Davis had time to prep you or not, but please be free to, I don't know, what do you do when you're on Zoom? Do people raise their hands, or do they just start talking?
I would have them raise your hands, and I'll address you.
Just signal you, huh?
Yeah, if not, it gets crazy.
You want to add or say something. And there are no dumb questions, so don't worry about that. And if I don't have answers, then I'll refer them to David, who I taught everything I knew once back in a missions class. So he knows everything now. Okay. The first time we did a training class that I was involved in overseas in Papua New Guinea, the instructor was he was actually a medical doctor, and he was doing his 4th Bible translation, I think, at the time. So he was very experienced and worked in a lot of different language areas. And he started out with what I thought was a dumb question. He said, what conditions need to be in place in order to do a Bible translation? So that's the first question I want to raise. And later we'll raise the question, why in the world should you do one in the first place? But the first question is, what conditions need to be in place in order for a Bible translation to take place? Well, of course, the answer is you go on Facebook and you just click on that Google button and it translates it, right? Well, that didn't exist back then. And guess what? You can't do a Google translation until after you've done the equivalent of the other things we'll be talking about over the next bit, because you can't do it when nobody knows nothing about the language you're trying to translate into. I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about outside people. So can anybody venture a guess of what needs to be in place, the minimum conditions or whatever, in order to do a Bible translation?
I'll take a guess.
Okay.
I'd have to think that there had to be some foreknowledge of God and Jesus to at least have something to reference to. That wasn't the right answer.
That's a good start, and I'll come back to it in a little bit. Let's see what things other people might have to say. And the answer is yes and no. So we'll come back and give the two parts of it in a little bit.
Since Dave was drinking rather than watching from my hand, I'll answer. I would think the first thing you need to do is have a desire to want to do it. You know?
Okay, that's another one with both yes and no, because we have done Bible translations in places where nobody wanted it. And in fact, we've had places where our translators have been attacked and had to be medically evacuated under emergency conditions. So it helps if people want to do it. But sometimes it's been under circumstances where they didn't. Okay, another one?
Yeah, Stan has one.
In the early church, the apostles needed the presence of the Holy Spirit.
That was one of the things that first trainer told people. Remember, you need to have the presence of the Holy Spirit. And I remember one of the guys I worked with from England, I won't try to replicate his British accent, but he said, remember, the guy who caused the Tower of Babel can also help us put them back together again. And many a time I've thought, oh yeah, it's like the Tower of Babel. We need God's help to put them back together again. I'm going to come back to you other two, but so don't lose what you're trying to have me interact with. Anybody else?
Funding, money.
Again, that's both. And I'll tell you a little quick one. I don't want to go very far with it, but when we first went to Papua New Guinea, I'd already been there before doing my graduate work, and I'd already been triggered in how I was going to work with people, that I wasn't going to come in as the Tuan or the Buana or whatever you call it, the person from outside that tells everybody what to do. And the reason that I had that thought so early on was I was going on a patrol with an old man. He was at least 15 years younger than I am now. He was in his 60s and I'm in my mid 70s. But he seemed like a really old man to me when I was a student. And we were going to another village and we came to the first creek, and the older man stopped and put everything down, and I put my stuff down. And he says, I got to go get somebody. And I says, why do you have to go get somebody? And he said, I have to go get somebody, Russ, because we've got to get you across this creek. And I thought, what in the world is going on in his head? And he said, well, we can't let you get your feet wet. And I looked at the creek, and at no place was it more than 6 inches deep. All I had to do was flip off my sandals and I could wade across. And so I proceeded to wade across. And it dawned on me that Papua New Guinea people had been shall I just say it straight, subjected to the control of, in their case, the Australian government for 50 years or longer, and that all those foreigners expected them to do stupid stuff like that for them. And I said, I'm never going to work in a situation where I'm not carrying my end of the load. Now, my end of the load was not always as good as some of theirs. Some of them were a lot stronger than me. We had a guy working with us one time that stood about the height of my mom, 4'8", and he could carry logs or big bundles of stuff that I would be sweating and struggling to even keep up with him. But in our situation, in our translation project, people do not take pay. Now, coming back to the business about money and funding, somebody had to pay for us to be there. So we had funding, but the local team, I talked to them about it, and they said, Russ, this is our Bible, and we'd be really embarrassed, and the people in our churches would be really embarrassed if we started taking money for translating our own Bible. And so it's a bit like a local church. You know, people teach classes, and people do this, and people do the other thing, and they don't get paid for it. But the old timers who'd come the generation before us were shocked when we didn't pay them. It wasn't ethical to not pay them. I said it would not have been ethical for me to pay them under the table when everybody in their community expected them to do it as volunteers. So it's interesting how those factors work out. And it turns out that the kinds of things that are most helpful are gifts that help them purchase the things they couldn't otherwise afford. Because the income level when we first went there was the equivalent of $70 US a year, or 80 or 90 or 100, depending on how many coconuts they dried and sold. So they can't afford to run big workshops and expensive equipment. The equipment that we're getting in place for them now to replace their last set of mini computers came from outside funding because they don't have that kind of money. So you help them all out with things that they can't afford to do themselves, but they're very embarrassed if they have to have you work. Now, let's go back to what were the other questions? What was our first one? Was that Mike? I can't remember.
Mike, it was Mike.
What was the first one?
Yeah, that was me.
What was the first?
And my response was God and Jesus had to be in the already known.
Okay.
Already, you know, something they can actually translate something into, you know, are they reading fiction or are they reading, you know, gospel? So.
Yeah, that one's very interesting. In Papua New Guinea and in places where the churches had come, people have knowledge of God that I think a friend in Africa said, it's an inch deep and a mile wide. So they've heard about it, but they don't necessarily know much about it. But the leader of our Papua New Guinean organization, when he would go to a new group, he would start talking to them about the 10 Commandments. And guess what? Except for maybe keeping the Sabbath as a separate day, you know, all those commandments about killing and not committing adultery and not stealing from your neighbors and stuff, I mean, they already had those. And so God had prepared them in some way for something to come. Now, whether they knew much about God or not depended on their background. And if you go to South Asia, they have different belief systems in which some places have lots of gods and some places have this concept of enlightenment and Buddha and who knows. You know, so there's lots of different views, but they're in Ecclesiastes, there's probably Solomon and said, God has planted eternity in the hearts of men. And that's sort of getting back at your concept, Mike, that they, there's probably, in a lot of people at least, there's a bit of a feeling for following God and knowing about God, even if they don't know a lot about it. And ultimately, it's going to be one of the key points. Now, who was the second one?
I was.
Okay.
I just said you need to want to go. To be a
Who needs to want?
translator.
Who needs to want to?
The translator to be.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess if we go kicking and dragging our heels, it probably doesn't work as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, I think we have one more question.
We got somebody else popping up too. We can finish more on that, Gloria, if we need to. So let's go back to the other one, and then we can finish more on that if we need to.
Well, getting back to what you asked the first time there, what's necessary to translate? I think the person that's translating it has to translate it literally, not giving other interpretations of the scripture. So it's got to be a literal translation.
Well, we'll come back to that part too, but the translator that's translating has to be faithful to the original.
Well, that's right, yeah.
Which may be a bit close to what you're trying to say, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. And I'll give you another story. This is terrible, David, because I keep thinking of all these things. I'd lived in a neighboring language group to where we work now back in the 60s when I was doing my studies. And I met some of the guys from that language. And one of the guys I'd met in town, and he had a university degree. Another guy had a university degree in linguistics even. I mean, they had all kinds of training. And they said to the Papua New Guinean Association of Bible Translators, they went to one of the leaders and they said, you know, we need Russ to come and help us do this, but we really need to do it right because it needs to reflect our Calvinist doctrine. You see, he was so educated that he even could label his doctrinal position of his denomination, and it was supposed to reflect that. And that ain't what it's supposed to be. It ain't supposed to reflect anybody's doctrine at the expense of the text itself. It reflects doctrines as the doctrines reflect what's in the Bible. But it doesn't reflect the doctrines by reading into the passage something that your point of view attempts to promulgate. And so I've been working in the last part of 1 Corinthians, and it talks about speaking in unknown tongues. Well, guess what? The word unknown isn't in there. It's just different languages. But modern versions of the Bible have put unknown or whatever in. So I have to try to bring it back to just what it actually says. And then if you're from a Pentecostal background and you want to work on that, you can work on that. And if somebody's from a different background and wants to tackle it another way, he can tackle it another way. But it's not my job to read into it an interpretation that's not supported by the Greek. So the biggest point is being honest with the original language. And when our team first started and they first met together, they had a big discussion at the place where we were staying. There was people from every area. You'd say township, I think, but it's bigger than a township and smaller than a county, a unit of government that's sort of in between those sizes. And one of the things they said was, they quoted from the book of Revelation in their neighboring language, and they said, we're not to add or subtract anything from this book. So I think that's sort of coming back at your point, and we'll go a little further in a little bit. Can I leave that part way there and then come to it in a minute or 5 minutes, whichever works out? We'll leave it as a starting point that we're starting to deal with it. And I want to come back to the other question, and then we'll start dealing with the various points in more detail. Whoever had their hand up has disappeared. Oh, there you are. No.
I was going to say Stan is still there. Stan had the last answer for you. He had put down the Holy Spirit got to be present.
Okay, that's okay. And the village, it was interesting in our area. There's a difference between Bible-less peoples and unreached peoples. And if you've gone to big mission conferences, they talk about the unreached peoples, the ones that have no effort of any sort in their area for evangelism. And Papua New Guinea has a lot of reached peoples, but they were reached in someone else's language, and they may or may not know what's going on when they try to read the scripture because they may not have a clear understanding of it. And in our case, there was missionary work by missionaries from the next language over, not missionaries from overseas, but missionaries from the next language over. Back in 1918, I think it was. And then afterwards, some more came. And so they'd been taught about Christianity in another language. And so they did have some knowledge, but it was very interesting that every time we translated a passage, people would say, "Oh, I never knew it meant that before." So you see, it was sort of occluded or cloudy or whatever you want to call it, because it was being filtered through someone else's language. And that was another one of the things they decided when they met together, was that, you know, they needed to do it in dependence on God. And there were enough people who really did have a knowledge of God that they understood that. But one of the languages just over the mountains from us had no knowledge of God at all. They were 25 miles away probably, and they heard the name, but they didn't know anything about God. They had no idea of how to practice a personal Christian faith. So it varies a lot from place to place, but in all cases, it needs dependence on the Holy Spirit.
Can I ask you one other question, Russ?
Okay, and then we'll come back to some of these things that we're partly along the way on.
I just thought this would be interesting. You mentioned the next language over down the road, over the mountains. Are there a lot of different languages in Papua New Guinea? I mean, that sounds like a lot to me already.
Yeah, okay. It might be a good time to pull up a map. So let me get out of this hide zoom if I can figure out how to do it. Whoops, it hid you guys. I don't want to hide you guys. I want to hide something else. Okay, it's still here. Let me get behind this one. I got to hide this one. Oh, I've got one that says David Starkey said the meeting will be at such and such time. I got to get out of behind that one. Let me find the one I'm trying to do. This does work, believe it or not. David and I practiced.
We tested it twice.
David and I tested it. Okay. I think this one's going to come up as a bit of a slideshow. So let me see if it works. Whoops, I didn't pull you guys up yet. Sorry. I didn't put it into the share. See, David's better at sharing because he's done this more than I have.
Only by a month or two with everything going on.
Okay.
While he's working on that, I want to mention a resource to you all. There's a book called The Peace Child where Russ was talking about the 10 Commandments. It's a very interesting missionary story about how God got into this village. I think you could even go on YouTube, check out The Peace Child, and you can see some actual 70s footage about what was going on and
okay.
Explain it.
Yeah, okay. Can you see Papua New Guinea?
Yep, yes. It's working.
Okay. The independent side is Papua New Guinea. The other side is called Irian Jaya, and the island is 1,500 miles long, so it stretches as far as from Oregon to the Mississippi River. This was my wife and I. She passed away this winter. That's some of our grandkids. This is just our province. There's 53 languages in our province. 54, sorry, languages in our province. And the one with the little circle around it, Buhutu, is where we were. And then this was a detail map of doing a survey. And we found 12 to 15 languages that needed Bible translation within a 60-mile radius. So the country is has 850 languages.
Phew.
The Indonesian side has another 300 and something. And between Indonesia, the rest of Indonesia, and the Indonesian side of the island of New Guinea and Papua New Guinea, there's 1,000 something languages. So it's over a sixth of all the languages in the world. Now, I'll ask you the next question, which can be led into from that. And how many languages are there in the world? Do a quick calculation there.
7,000? No, 6,000?
Seven. It's actually, we were under a sixth, so it's actually 7,100 and something.
That's close. I said 7,000.
Yeah, it's over 7,000. And we thought we were on the last 1,500 getting started. And then they discovered that we hadn't taken into account the sign languages. And there's only one sign language that has a good translation, and that's the one that you see on TV in the States when they're interpreting alongside a news person or something. And they have some others that have portions done. And we have a friend who was a sign language teacher from childhood up. She went to East Africa and she worked with 4 or 5 different sign languages. And she came back to America and she said, I can't sign in American Sign Language anymore because the others kept jumping in ahead of it. But there's probably 500 sign languages, 400. It's hard, very, very hard to measure because some of them are so tiny and remote that they're almost unique to certain families.
All right, we have another question for Mike.
Okay, Mike?
Russ, so with that many languages in Papua New Guinea, is there like a base language that everybody kind of understands? I mean, you can't possibly say that, you know, the government there has to learn every different language to know, you know, how to communicate with people. I mean, so it should be is there a baseline? I mean, I know that Germany itself, if you go from different parts of Germany, I understand that the accents and the verbal, you know, verbularities, or what you want to call it, vary from area to area. But there's a basic German dialect that they all, you know,
Yeah,
react
because they learn High German, which was the language that Martin Luther's Bible was written in, with some changes over the several hundred years. Then they can talk to each other. We had translation teams from Austria and Germany, and I studied a little German in school. I thought I could at least hear it a bit. And this Austrian couple started talking, and I had no idea what they were talking about. It sounded German, but everything was different, you know. So Papua New Guinea, I don't know if you'd say it's been blessed by this concept or not, but has 850 languages, sorry. And the largest language group is under 60,000. And we personally surveyed some of them that were under 50 people, and the average is 1,000. So there is no single dominant language. That's the facts on the ground for the languages themselves. However, education was done in English probably by I'd say 60s. When I was there the first time, they were trying hard to do education in English. The 50s and before, they do education in whatever church language was in the area. But as the government took more and more on, so they have English education, and you do secondary education, and you do university level education, and teachers college and nurses training and so forth. You do all those in English. The government has 3 official languages, English and Tok Pisin. You guys sabi long dispelakan talk? Me talk long name belong en Mike, na name belong en David, na name belong en Gloria, na you go all same. Neil, na Kristen, na all same. That's Tok Pigeon. And Tok Pigeon has 60 or more % English vocabulary, some German vocabulary, and quite a bit of vocabulary from local languages. And it's a very widespread language that they call a language of wider communication. So when you go outside your home area, you might use English, or you might use Tok Pigeon English. to speak to people that don't understand your language. And the third one is Motu. And Motu was a trade language before Western contact. And the people at what is now the capital city, Port Moresby, built huge multi-hulled trading canoes, not 2 hulls, not catamarans, but 5 Morans or 6 Morans or whatever, just a whole bunch of hulls under them. And they made cooking pots, and they loaded these giant canoes up with cooking pots, and they set sail at the season of the year when they had a following wind, went to the next province, what's now the next province over, and traded their cooking pots for food. Sago and different kinds of things that these other people had in abundance. And then when the trade winds shifted, they sailed back to their own place. And this went on for hundreds of years, and it became a trading language all along the whole south coast of New Guinea. And so you have 3 national languages. People in our province, the old people can speak Motu. The people my age, some can speak Motu and some can't. The people David and Courtney's age, not very many of them would speak Motu. So it's definitely the older generations. And I don't think I've met any little kids that can speak that one, because it's no longer used by the government for local business. And it's used in the churches at the church councils and church meetings, like an equivalent of a district assembly. They may be using Motu at the district assembly, but the little kids aren't sitting in those big meetings, so they're not getting any reinforcement. So that one is sliding off the radar. So they're going to be just 2, English and talk pidgin English, that are the widespread ones. Now, here's the issue. Our next door neighbor, where our center was in our province, came down to me one day. His name was Calado. And Calado said, Russ, I need you to help me, because we've got our Bible college started and we're trying to get equipment for the college. And I've heard about these funding groups that can help pay for things. And I've got this letter I've written to them to appeal for help. And he said, could you help me with this letter? This guy has a Bible college and a seminary education. I mean, he's tertiary of tertiary, you know, he's had a lot of education. He went home, I sat down with his letter and I looked at it and I said, I haven't the foggiest notion of what he's trying to say in English. And so I worked on it a second day and I still couldn't figure it out. So I sent a message to him. I said, Pastor Calado, you're going to have to come back and explain to me what you're trying to say in this letter. So he came back and he explained it to me in English, but not as complicated as in his letter. And I figured out what he was trying to ask about, and I helped him write a letter in straightforward English that could get his point across. It's very, very hard to replicate the knowledge that we have of our mother tongue when we learn it as an older person, is what I'm saying. And so another young lady, will come back to her probably later. She had grade 12 education and she was very fluent in English, and she could chatter like a magpie in English. Very smart young lady. And she said, Russ, it wasn't until we helped do the checking on the book of Acts that I realized how much there is in the book of Acts that doesn't come through in English. Now, it comes through to you and I in English because that's our language, but it wasn't coming through to her in English. It came through to her in her own mother tongue. So the 2 major languages are used a lot. The third one is used in some provinces and by older people, but not by the little kids aren't picking it up. But other than that, it's those 850 languages. And you saw the map, and then the more detailed map. I used to tell people, if I walk for one day, this is through the jungle in rough terrain, if I walk for one day, people are going to speak differently than where I started from. If I walk for 2 days, I probably have trouble understanding them. If I walk for 3 days, it's so completely different, I'd have to stop and learn the language. Just extreme diversity of languages. Now, in the highlands where they have huge, huge fertile valleys, you might have to walk for 3 days to get across one, because they're different geographic terrain, you know, but it's the same principle. If you walk to the edge of the group, then you know, another day you're probably having more trouble, and by the third day you're probably in a completely different one that you don't understand. And we have in our area 5 small language groups that we're hoping our team can help with that seem very much like ours. And when we listen to them, the sounds in their alphabet are all the same. And when you listen, you can sort of tell the sentences are put together in the same way. You know, all the endings on the words match and so forth. But there's so many words that when I first heard one of the guys from one of these neighboring areas, it seemed like about every third word was just bleeped out. I had no idea what he was saying. And if the third word happens to be an important word, then you don't know anything about what's going on. So even when they're similar, they still have a lot of differences. And I will ask this question for one of you, just in case you have already thought of it. Why do they have so many? And the answers are related to terrain and geography, very, very difficult mountainous terrain, or else miles and miles of swamps. The big river on the south side of the country is called the Fly River, and the tide goes in 200 miles. So it's, you know, just huge areas of swampland in that part of the country. Where we are, some of our friends were working in a mountain language that was probably less than 25 miles inland from the coast. And when they walked in and went up a river valley, the husband and wife pulled each other across the river, as you had to cross from one side to the other to get a place to walk, 40 times to get up to this village in less than 25 miles. Just extremely steep terrain. So between the steep terrain and the dense jungles and the swamps, depending on which part of the country, terrain is one of the factors. The second factor was that everybody had as a goal to eat their enemies, and they did. And people have showed me the place where they used to cut up the victims, and the place where we are, they no longer do that. Nobody else does that to my knowledge. In fact, the latest report I've had of true cannibalism has been in the, not Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, where in some outlying provinces of China, in order to prove their loyalty to the party, people had to eat the person that was condemned by the government. So cannibalism is no longer there, but the biggest one by far was sorcery. And people were scared to death of somebody from an outside area coming in and doing sorcery on them. So you have the terrain, you had cannibalism and warfare, and then you had sorcery. And this has been going on for thousands of years. Before the time of Christ, they have archaeological evidence of gardens from probably before the farming era in the Middle East, you know, so it's a long, long time. You dig way down deep in the ground in these trenches and you find old spades, actually, very long-handled spades that they used to dig ditches. And they'd fallen down in the bottom of a ditch and got covered up by mud, and they've been fossilized. So a very long prehistory with no dominant groups. Unlike a place like Nigeria, where you have 4 big groups and they're fighting each other all the time, trying to see who will be top dog. And a lot of the persecution of the Christians in Nigeria right now is because one of the big groups, which is Muslim, is trying to fight one of the somewhat smaller big groups, which is on the Christian side of the equation. So that's a bit of the situation. And when we went there, they had 750 languages. And by the time our first furlough was over, we had counted over 800 languages, and it's now 850 because you keep finding more as you go further and further into these areas. And my wife and I, in fact, interviewed people from several language groups that weren't on any of the famous linguists' maps, you know. So you just keep finding more we're probably getting near the end of the spoken languages, but we don't have the sign languages pinned down yet. So I think we have fewer than 200 to go, and Wycliffe's been there since 1954. Okay, now let's see if we can come back to some of these things. I'll give you the simplest sufficient condition of all, and all of yours feed into it, so they're not off, but they're feeding into it. But the simplest condition of all for what you need to do to translate into another language is you have to have people who know 2 languages. It's so simple, nobody thought of it. It's like, yeah, leaves have trees. You know, you have to have people that speak more than 1 language. And it's a trick question in a way. And Pastor David and I were talking a couple of days ago. It's a trick question in a way because the mother tongue speakers of Papua New Guinea languages who do Bible translation mostly do not have the kind of education that you and I have had the opportunity to have. And I reckoned back again to Ogilvie, and I don't know about your part of New York State, but in central Michigan, when everybody was a farmer, my 2 grandfathers, one had grade 2 and the other had grade 6. And they were put to work when they were young and they didn't go back to school. It doesn't mean they weren't educated, but it means they weren't educated in the school. My dad went through 8th grade. His youngest siblings went all the way through high school because the family, he was 20-something years older than the youngest, and times had changed during that time. But when he went to country school, he went through grade 8, and then he got a job, and then he went in the service, and then the GI Bill paid for him to go to college, so he took the GED exam and got accepted into Marion College, which is now called Indiana Wesleyan University. And his first English teacher gave him A's for content and C's and D's for grammar because he was a Michigan hillbilly. And David says, you don't call them hillbillies there, but you got another name for, you know, us people that grew up that way. Anyhow, so when I went to Papua New Guinea, it seemed to me like I was stepping back into my parents' or grandparents' generation in terms of opportunities. Because the country was newly independent in 1975 and they were building up their structures bit by bit. And our translators, some have grade 6, some had a little bit less than grade 6, a couple had grade 8, and later on we've now got a few that have grade 10 or 12. Grade 10 is a normal leaving spot in the Commonwealth system. A grade 10 leaver goes on and does a technical training program. So an electrician or even nurses before, now nurses go all the way through to grade 12 and then do nurses training. But, you know, agriculture experts and so forth will drop out of the community high school system and then go to the trade schools, or else just drop out. And so people come up to me and they say, Russ, I'm a grade 6 dropout, or I'm a grade 8 dropout, or I'm a grade 10 dropout, or whatever. And only a tiny handful had higher levels of education. When I worked in a training course later, I found a couple of guys had actually, in neighboring languages, had actually done university. So our average translators have probably less education than anybody I'm talking to right now. I doubt if any of you dropped out at grade 6 or even grade 10. You know, we do get people dropping out at grade 10, but grade 6, you don't have very, well, America is supposedly doesn't let you drop out that lower level anymore.
Okay, Callie's wrapping up grade 10 right now and she's passing, so we
Yeah,
don't
so
have anybody lower than 10.
Okay, so Callie would be at the level of our most educated translators when we first started.
Wow.
So you've
Right,
got people who
a job
don't.
for Kelly right there.
Callie, my oldest daughter desperately wanted to drop out at the end of grade 10, just like the Australian kids did. And we said, no, in America, that's not an option. But she said, but I'll just move to Australia because I can drop out at grade 10 and nobody worries about it. She didn't. She went on to do university too, but she, at that stage in her life, it was important. Anyway, so you have people with not a lot of education. And I don't know, some of you were alluding to how much knowledge you have of the Bible and of God. And their knowledge of the Bible and of God is filtered through some other language. They did not have Sunday schools. We have Sunday schools now, but they did not have when we went there for kids or adults. And so they did not have a lot of Bible training. And I had one of our guys who's now one of the lead translators had Noah and Moses and somebody else all in the same Bible story. I mean, that's how little he knew about the Old Testament. And I just listened to him tell the story to the little kids. They were enwrapped by his storytelling. And I didn't say anything to him. I just said, we're going to have to get him trained, which he now is. But at that time, he knew so little about the Old Testament that he had all these famous characters all mixed up. So you've got that on the one side, and then you've got the knowledge that's needed on the source language side on the other. And they can translate from their neighboring language, the ones that went to school in that language. Some of them, the older ones, did go to school in that neighboring mission language. But English was a long haul, and things could get mixed up very easily. We had 10 or 12 language groups that all had the whole region on fire when Moses saw the burning bush. Very simple reason. Australian English, the bush is the outback. In the outback is everything that grows that's not in a town. And so when they said the bush burned what was not consumed, then they saw a vision in their heads of their whole jungle being on fire.
Oh, no.
You know, and it's just those little things about the English language. That's just an easy one that's easy to point out. But it's just those little things that you have to deal with. So what is the solution to it? Now, I tried to get your pastor to get somebody to do this with him, but he said it'd be a little awkward. So visualize it if you can. This first trainer that they had said, you need to learn to work together. Why? Because some people know the local language very well. That's often called the target language. They often know the local language very well. And some people may know English or Spanish or French or whatever the language is that is used by the translators, know that one very well. And some people know Greek and some people know nothing about Greek and so forth. That's why in America, everybody says it's all Greek to me all the time, you know, because we don't have a requirement like the Muslims do that you're supposed to learn the language of the Bible itself in order to read it. And so most Americans don't learn that language. So you have people that have knowledge of the source language or languages and people that have the knowledge of the receptor language or the target language. And he told them, you need to work together. So he got two guys up in front of the room and he had them stand side by side and he tied their legs together and he says, now walk. And so they had to learn how to have one person put his outside leg forward, both of them put their middle leg forward together, and the other guy put his outside leg forward, and learn how to walk together. And that's what they have to learn how to do. And when they went back to the village after the workshop and they reported to the community, one of the young guys got up that had been in the workshop and he lowered his head very politely, lowered his eyes, did not stare his elders directly in the face, but was respectful to them. And he said, we learned that we need your help to do our Bible translation because you know the local language very well. You've grown up speaking our language all your lives. You know things we don't even know about our language. You need to help us with the difficult things on our language side. And they said, and we know some English, and so we'll work really hard on the English side to try to explain to you what it means. And so that's what they had to do, and that's what they did, and they've done it ever since. And at one time, we had a quarter of our language group helping with the process. We'll come to that later on in the sequence of things. And then petered off for a bit, and now I think we're back up to probably over a quarter. Now, that's not a big number when you consider that the whole language is less than 1,500 people. But it still is a big percentage. And that's sort of a aim you could aim for in your communities there. You know, we should permeate our whole community in some way with the gospel so that at least a quarter of them have hands-on experience with us. And then the others will know about it. Anyhow,
We're working on it, Russ.
yeah, you'll get there. Anyhow, let me come back to one of the other questions that I'm trying to remember. Which one of you was talking about you have to translate? Basically, you're saying you have to translate what it says, okay?
That was Neil.
Okay, and
Wait, Neil.
it's very interesting how we go about the translation process. And you can say, I've got a word here. Can you see this? I've got a word here. That's my chalk. In English or Greek. And I've got a word over here in Buhutu, the language we work in. I got those too close, don't I?
That's
and
good.
Obviously, the thing I'm supposed to do is just go zip straight over. Zip straight over. And so you say, En arche hein ho logos. Oh, that's Greek, sorry. In the beginning was the word, and you just go straight across. But the problem is that if you put the literal meaning, word for word, under the Greek, it won't make sense in the other language because each language has its own structure. And in Buhutu, for instance, the verb comes at the end and the subject comes at the beginning. Well, that's like you, but the thing that you're talking about, like we have very violent examples in linguistics. We say the dog bit the pig, or the farmer killed the duckling, or whatever. So if you say the dog bit the pig, in Buhutu you say the dog, the pig bit. Whereas in English we say the dog bit the pig. Or in English we can say the dog was bitten by the pig. We can flip it around, but we have to change the structure in the middle of how it's glued together. And so you can't go straight across without violating the laws of how the language is put together, the pieces. So that's the first issue. And the second issue is, and we can come back to this later too, sometimes in parts of the world like Papua New Guinea, you can't say abstract things like love or peace or joy or forgiveness or any of those things. You have to say them as verbs, as action words. And so sometimes they change categories. So it becomes a different kind of word. And so the notion of going straight across works sometimes, but basically there's a thing that goes like this. Now, don't pay attention to my little hook that I hooked it together with. I didn't come up with a fancy one. You go from the meaning in English or Greek to the meaning over here in Buhutu, but you have to go through all of that structure that I told about that the languages have, the English or Greek structure and or the Buhutu structure, and you have to go up to where they join together and it turns together. That's basically at the sentence level. And you say, what does this sentence mean? And when you figure out what this sentence means, then you say, okay, they said it this way over here in English or Greek, but they say it this way over here in Buhutu, and so you get the same meaning as you have in the original language, and that's what you're supposed to do, but you can't always go straight across because you have to mediate it, you might say, or have an intervening step that gets you to the meaning and then says, okay, the meaning of that dog bit the pig comes out, the dog the pig bit, in Buhutu, so I got to turn the words around a little bit or whatever. So it's still the straight meaning, but you can't do it by just putting it underneath the other language and then just stringing it together.
I was talking more about doctrinal changes. I wasn't
Yeah.
talking
So,
about
yeah, we
getting
don't,
the meaning of the words would, you know, there are words that you're not going to be able to translate into another language,
yeah.
but I was
I'll
talking more.
I'll give you an example that's all the way through the epistles. And they had a mess because every time they tackled this word that they saw in English, they tried to almost start over from scratch and figure out how to say it. And the word was conscience. His conscience bothered him, or his conscience will tell him whether he should or shouldn't do something. Well, that's an easy word, and we've all had our consciences bother us. And even your pastor may have filched cookies when his mother didn't want him to. And, you know, I mean, you know, we've gotten ourselves tempted by things, and maybe our consciences have bothered us. But they had so many different ways to tackle it. I wasn't, what in the world are we going to do? And then I found a solution that someone had come up with, and I tried it out, and I think it's going to work throughout most of the passages. And it says, the place of only good thinking inside us. And it takes 4 words. But it's a place inside us that's responsible for straight thinking or proper thinking. Actually, good can be added in there to reinforce it. The key word is the place of straight thinking only. And it might maybe not 100% there, but I think it's going to work. But they had so many different ones that we just went round and round and round. And most of what my job is going back to the Greek and going back to the source languages and trying to figure out how to get those things stated in such a way that they just jump out at people and they say, oh yeah, that's what it means, rather than searching around. So that's a little bit of that background. Now, where are we at on the time, David? Because I think we need to do a couple other things, and then we'll see how we go here.
Yeah, you got plenty of time.
Yeah, I think I'm going to show an overview of the whole process. And then after we do that, then we'll start and talk in depth of maybe 1 or 2 things. I've still got more of these more general things, but that's fine. They can be another time. Okay, let me see if I can spot it. I'm going to have to get behind Zoom for a second and pull this one up. Okay. Oh, why'd that one come up? Okay. I think you guys can probably see me, but I can't see you at the moment.
Yeah, we still see you.
Okay, I'm going to load this thing up. All right, now I can come back in with you all.
And for you Zoom experts, we find you got to load it up on your screen before you can share, or you guys would see nothing. So
yeah,
that's a peek behind the curtain.
Pastor, yeah, there needs to be some little show going on in front of the curtain, David. Pastor David, you can song and dance or whatever you do with those things. Okay. Okay, I'm not worried that you look at the details of this, but I want you to see the main topics, okay? And these are some of the key things that are involved when you do Bible translation, and I'll give little bits of stuff now, and then we'll come back in detail on some of them later on. Okay. The first thing you have to know is whether or not a language group already has the Bible in a language they can understand. And in our case, people knew that language from the mission because they'd gone to school. Some of the older people had gone to school in that language. And in fact, the leader of that denomination told us, me and the guy I was with, they said, they don't need to have a translation in their own language. They already know Suao. the mission language. And unfortunately for him, and fortunately for me, that was the language I'd studied when I went there as a student, and I pretended like I didn't know what he was saying. So I just let the church leaders talk back and forth, and he was very sure that they didn't need a translation because they'd already had a translation in their mission language. That's the language which, when they get translated into their own language, Buhutu, they say, oh, we never knew it meant this before. But of course, he didn't believe that. So, and he didn't know their local language. He was from another area, and he was speaking to them in that mission language, not in his. So do they have a Bible in a language they can understand? And this is a fairly lengthy process. And I said to Pastor David that you can also actually take a whole university major in each of these topics. So there's lots and lots that they have to know in order to do this. But when you go into an area and do a survey, you find out how much shared vocabulary they have from a set predetermined list. And then you do all kinds of questions that find out what their networks of association are. And just lots and lots of factors, education and church and culture and on and on. And I think it's a 6-part assessment. And a fairly lengthy process, and we can show you some more things related to that later. And I'll just give you a couple things quickly. One time, one of our friends said they got put in the wrong place, at least in part because of the survey not having all of the information needed. And the people of the language group didn't want the apple cart upset, didn't want anything upset in how they were doing things in their culture. And so they took the Bible translation couple from overseas, in this case from Canada, and put them in the most remote village of their whole language area so they wouldn't interfere with anything. And after they'd been there for 3 or 4 years, they said, oh, we're not put in the middle of this group, we're put on the edge. Why were we put on the edge? And finally somebody confessed that they did it to them on purpose to keep them from interfering with things. Another guy hadn't surveyed the area properly, and he didn't give, I guess, equal audience to the different denominations. In this particular case, it was the Catholics that didn't get any part in their translation project. And you can understand most Bible translators are, middle of the road, evangelical Protestants and so forth and so on. But, if you don't involve the Catholics, then they're not going to use it when you get done. And so in a sense, you've excluded a whole subgroup, a people group, by not interacting with them. And we do that in our outreach in our communities sometimes too. We put our blinders on and don't notice the other people that live there because they're in some way different. But anyway, it wasn't until he got all the people groups involved equally that it took off and people started using it. They were almost done when he found this out, that he had not done that. Okay, the second one is training. And training takes place usually in the home country or a neighboring country of the people who become missionaries. And it takes place in their own country or sometimes a neighboring country for the local people who become Bible translators. So there's 2 different cycles of training, one for the expatriate or foreign people who come in, and another cycle of training within the country for the people that live there. And after I taught classes for the expatriates, a couple of different rounds of workshops, I told our directors, I said, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to be respectful here, but I don't want to train any more expatriates unless there's at least an equal number of local people involved. Because I think I'm wasting my time training you guys all over again who's supposedly taken all your courses in the first place. We need to be training local people how to work effectively in their languages. And since then, I've trained, I don't know how many, 80-something language groups. I've helped train people in 80-something local language groups. So I've been able to do that. So training, and it involves a lot of time and a lot of work, whether it's on the ground in the local culture or whether it's with overseas trainees. Team building, building the group that will work together to do the project. You're not going to have a project that sells itself if you've excluded part of the community. And like I said, at one time we counted a quarter of our language group who had been involved personally. I think we're back to about that level again with a lull in the middle. And if we have 95% of the people that are big enough to help, old enough to help, we won't worry about it. And sometimes it's kids. I mean, sometimes we have 8, 10-year-old kids that are just as helpful as the older people. So building a team. And ours was very interesting because I didn't do the team building. A local guy who had gone off and had government training and worked with local and regional government in other provinces came back home to help his people. And when he came back, he was what was called the local government clerk. We'd say clerk, C-L-E-R-K. And the local government clerk was responsible for documenting all the court cases in the local courts. So this is be sort of like justice of the peace level or slightly higher than that, I suppose. And every time they had an official court, he had to be there and he had to document the discussions and the penalties, the sentences, everything. And so he took me with him to all the local court sessions. And then I'd sit outside and visit with people. And then when it was over, he'd come outside and he'd explain about Bible translation to them. And he set up the whole thing. So it was, none of it was set up by me. It was all set up by him. But he and I talked about it for probably days or nights, I should say, sometimes late in the night, about what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for having this be able to work. So every place has a different kind of team, but that's what that is. Literacy, why would that be of any use to anybody?
They need to be able to read that Bible that you are translating for them.
And that's what we always used to say. up until the 1970s and into the 80s, quite a bit, maybe the 90s. But by the turn of the 21st century, what else has been happening in the world that changes the basis for how the Bible does not have to be a closed book?
I remember the answer now because we talked about it. Anybody else want to guess what changed where it wasn't just about literacy?
Well, audio Bibles, right?
Right, audio and video. And our teams now are being trained to do videos. They're trained to do audio things. All of the published scriptures that we have published thus far are in an audio version as well as in a printed version. And hundreds and hundreds of Bible stories are in both an audio and a printed version. And people can listen or watch depending on whether they have a smart or dumb what? Phone. Everybody all over the planet has phones. It's the whole planet has changed. And we don't get enough bars some places to get good reception. I remember walking down the road trying to get enough reception so I could call back to the States to my wife. And one of my friends, their group was very remote and they had to climb a tree at one end of their island in order to get reception, but that's what they did. And bit by bit, the chinks are being filled in. And I am not sure, I don't have statistics on it, but I have a feeling that probably more people in our language have scripture on audio, in audio mode than they do in print mode. They have it available in both, but people really like the audio one. I'm going to come back to literacy after a bit. If we have time tonight, David, you have to help me time it here.
Yeah, I'm watching it. I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
Okay, so literacy was utterly crucial, and people would say, oh, the Wycliffe translators came in and they invented a language for them. No, they already had a language. Then then they'd back off and they say, oh, they invented an alphabet for them. Well, you wrote down an alphabet and helped them just develop it, but they already had the sounds of their language. All the pieces were there. All you had to do is get them in a form where people could use them. And in our particular case, the Catholics had come up with a writing system for the what do you call them? The Sunday prayers and the Sunday readings, and not the readings, but the prayers and stuff. And their alphabet was 99% right, so we didn't have to start from zero. But meanwhile, all over the country, we started from zero in hundreds of languages, helping them come up with the alphabets. I don't know if we got all 800 of them, but we got more than 600, I'm sure, that they have writing systems. Okay, translating, and that's the core one, of course, and we'll come back to that one after a bit too for more. And we've talked quite a bit about already. But here's the thing. The goal is this: changed lives. The goal is not that people learn how to read and write. The goal is not that they survey their language boundaries and say, oh, we're here and those people are right across the river there and all that. The goal is that people's lives be changed. And one of the key things that's going on is called scripture engagement. And one of the workshops that people do in particular is called Christianity and Culture. This is just an example of all of this. But in the Christianity and Culture class, church leaders, not necessarily pastors, but leaders from different churches, come together and they discuss all of these kinds of things. And in the process of it, you learn how to deal with things like sorcery and alternate belief systems that might not match up with the Bible, because you look at what the Bible culture and the Bible says, and you look at what local culture and local culture says, and then you try to determine it. I'll give you one example of that, and then we'll go to literacy. In our earlier years, we had a little double cab Hilux truck. All over the world except America, they had double cab trucks, pickup trucks, these little tiny ones. And it was a really big deal in America, and ours was worn out by the time it came along as a big deal in America. These, where you have a seat behind, a four-door pickup truck with the seats behind. And we told people we don't go back and forth to town unless there's a need for it. But anytime somebody's sick, it doesn't matter middle of the night or when, if you need us, we'll get transportation for you to get to the nearest medical center. And sure enough, they came in the middle of the night, and an older man whom we knew was suffering greatly from an asthma attack. And so I got the truck out. It was probably 2 a.m, something like that. Got the little truck out. We went down the road to their village, which is less than 5 miles away. And some people had piled in the back, but I didn't know who was there. And there was a canopy over it. We got there, and sure enough, this older man was on there, sort of a porch-like area, and he was gasping for breath. And there was another person right beside him. And the other person was muttering very quietly. You couldn't hear what he was saying. It was indistinguishable, and saying something very quietly. And out of the back of our truck had popped the aid post orderly, which is the equivalent of the barefoot doctor or practitioner, the local government health center. And he went under the house. All the houses are built up on stilts. He went under the house and built a little fire, got out his little metal box and put all his instruments in it and closed the lid and boiled it to sterilize his instruments. And I asked him what he was going to do. And he says, well, I don't have anything else right now. And I don't have an inhaler for him, but I'll give him an injection of adrenaline and maybe it'll knock it out and then we won't have to take him into the hospital. So he was getting his instruments ready. And while I was talking to him, I knew him from before. And I said, Babu Nana, I said, what is that other guy doing up there on the veranda with the old man who has asthma? And he said, oh, Russ, he's a Taukoba. Well, one of the things you need to learn to do is to bluff. And I didn't know very much about Taukoba, but I happened to know that the Taukoba was the traditional healer. And so I pretended like I knew everything he was talking about. I says, oh, and do you know what the Taukobakoba was doing? And he said, well, I think he's saying some kind of a traditional prayer. And I said, well, who's he praying to? I don't know. He said that the Taukobakoba, they'll come to, and they'll do some kind of traditional prayer and they try to heal people. So the Taukobakoba had prayed, and then the government health officer took his medicine up and gave the guy's injection, and he recovered, and we didn't have to take him into hospital. And I don't know who got the credit, the Taukobakoba or the government health officer, but the young men from that family, I talked to them afterwards, and I just says, oh, what was the Taukobakoba doing? And these were 3 young men that had all gone off to tertiary institutions, one agriculture, one forestry, and one government service. And so they hadn't lived at home in their crucial growing up years. And they says, we don't know what the Taukobakoba does. And I says, well, how do you know how to deal with the Taukobakoba then? And they said, we don't know what to do. And I said, well, why don't you learn more about it? Find out more about it. See if you can figure out what's going on. And I don't know if one of them came up with the research that gave the answer, or if somebody else told me, because I talked to several different people about it. And anyway, he was praying to some spirits that supposedly resided up on the top of the mountains. So I said, how does that relate to your Christian faith? And they said, oh, we're only supposed to pray to God. We're not supposed to pray to anybody else. I said, well, then how do you deal with the Taukobakoba? And they said, well, we'll know what to do next time. And it turned out that their denomination had not dealt with the issue of Christianity meets culture, and they were just letting it drift along. But the other denomination had seen the function of the Taukobakoba, and they said, in the Bible, does it not teach us that we should pray for the sick? And so they had Taukobakoba who were Christians, who were like on a lay, not witness team, but a lay ministry team. And they would go to the people that were sick and they would pray for them in the name of Jesus. So one culture had dealt with it in terms of their Christian faith and the other hadn't. One denomination, I should say. Now, if we've got time, that's related to this business of changed lives. If we've got time, David, I'll go back to literacy and just do a little bit for that, and we'll close it out tonight.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. All right. So I need to get out of this one. So close it. You'll probably see my face, but you won't see what I'm doing for a bit here. I'm going to go back to, I can't go back to share screen till I get the screen to share. Is it in this one?
Yeah, and while Russ is working on that, I think it's interesting to mention that even in our own area, we've kind of have a new version of the witch doctors coming up with a lot of the new age stuff that's around here. I'm sure a couple of you know people in our community that put crystals in their bras for power and money. That stuff's happening even in our community. So it's kind of interesting as that stuff comes up to address. So
one of the big Wesleyan churches in San Diego, Skyline Wesleyan Church, years ago, the associate pastor had been a missionary in Sierra Leone, and when he came to work under, I can't think of the name now. Anyway, the head pastor, he brought some fellow missionaries over from Sierra Leone to work with him in San Diego so they could deal with all this kind of stuff. He said, these guys know it firsthand, so they'll be able to recognize it when they see it in the American culture. Now, does this come up?
no, we're still on the squares here.
Okay, I'm almost there. All right. Okay, I missed one. There it is.
Yep.
Okay. Usually I throw other things into some of these slideshows along with the stuff that the topic is. This is me and my wife gathering kangkung, which was a new vegetable that had come into Papua New Guinea from South Asia. And Cancun grows in wet places where the water is moving sluggishly, a bit like watercress maybe. The environment like watercress would grow, it would grow. And they have little arrowhead-shaped leaves, and they make a really nice green. So I was out in the middle of it gathering it in my bag, and Mary was trying to decide whether to wade into the mud or not to get some. Their main cash crop is oil palm, and I forgot I had this old picture of it. But oil palm is the blessing and the bane of all the developing countries, because they've knocked down thousands upon thousands of acres of rainforest and planted this palm tree, and you have to harvest it every 2 weeks year-round, slack season and peak season, but it's still ready every 2 weeks. And we used to see wallabies about where that guy is. We haven't seen wallabies for years. We used to see cassowary. We haven't seen cassowary for years. A lot of the little birds have retreated far into the mountains, and the whole ecosystem is hit by the same kinds of things that we have here when we clear cut everything. And so that's the environment. Now I want to go to the literacy, and here's the workshop. Now you guys are in my picture a little bit, but I think everything's there.
Yeah.
My wife is kneeling. Can you see my cursor going around?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
My wife is kneeling on the floor doing some of the work. The lady in the back is from Japan, and she was the teacher, and she was training us how to make these books. And we pre-printed the pictures, and then people wrote in the words in their own language. And as soon as you get an outline picture anywhere in Papua New Guinea, and you have anything that's colored, like a colored pencil or a crayon, they'll immediately stop and color the pictures. So all of their pictures were fully illustrated and in color by the time they got their books done. And you see people brought their kids with them, and they're working away. I'm watching another group. That's back when my beard had slightly more color in it, and people working all over. And one of the interesting things we did was use cardboard boxes, and I'll show you this in a couple minutes. And you'd cut them so that the grains crossed one another. So one length of cardboard went sideways, the other length of cardboard, the grain went the other way, and then you laminated them together, and they were very sturdy. And I'll give you the reason for that in a minute. But she was teaching us how to do all this kind of stuff. I've got to get to the next picture. Okay, people are getting quite a ways along the way. You see that the furniture is mats. The church pews are mats. The dining room table is a mat. Your bed is a mat. Your lounge chair out in the yard is a mat. Your whole house is furnished with mats, which you roll up and stand them in the corner, and then you spread them out. You shake them in the mornings, roll them up, and do it again. You can get a lot more people in your church when you sit on mats instead of on pews. I think you can maybe triple the number. So if we get to the stage where your church is just bulging at the seams, say, okay, Pastor David said we're going to switch to mats, and we can get 3 times as many people. Anyway, all of us were learning how to do the various tasks, Mary and I included, because we'd never done this kind of stuff either. And then when we got done, we did activities with the stories. So I'm going to stop for a minute and explain the method of literacy. Are any of you guys teachers? Or have you been elementary teachers, any of you? There's one. Okay. I was in the Dick and Jane era. Were you past the Dick and Jane era when you were teaching? Oh, she's muted.
Alice and Jerry, rather.
What's that?
Say it again.
I said we did Alice and Jerry.
Oh, okay. Anyway, I collected a lot of elementary reading textbooks, especially when I went overseas, so that teachers would have stories that they could read other than in their own curriculum. And there were lots of different approaches. And it seemed like in America, we got to the stage where we had to invent a new one every 3 to 5 years so that the textbook publishers could continue getting rich. I don't know why, but anyhow, some of the people do what's called bottom-up reading methods, starting with phonics. And some people start with top-down methods, what they call reading for meaning or reading for learning or whatever. And if they do phonics, they do it later. This method had 5 principles. And can you see my hand? Okay, I got too close. The 5 principles were: you talk, you read, you talk, you read, and you do. Whoops, so talk, read, do. And what you do is you read the whole story with natural intonation. You see the lady with this pointer pointing to the book, and the children sort of follow along with you. And then you stop. Well, no, first you talk about whatever's in the book. So it's about frogs or pigs or whatever the creatures are. Then you'd read it within that natural intonation. Then you stop and talk about it again. Then you read it again. And the kids are sort of tracking along with you. And then in the last one, the do stage, you do things with phonics and you do all the other kinds of things. And I've got a whole set of lesson materials I could show you. And they learn how to associate the print with the meaning, or the sounds, I should say. And so one of their first stories, let me see if you can see this. Does this override the rest? Can you see that one? Is it backwards?
Yeah, I think everybody should be able to
Can
see your
see it.
square because you were talking. So
Yeah, but this is backwards, right?
No, it's good.
right.
That's
Okay,
right.
it's backwards on mine, so it must be frontwards on yours. There's a story called The Big Mouth Frog. So you talk about frogs, then you read the book, and then in the book, let me see where I can get somewhere. The frog asks the pig, "What do you feed your children to eat?" And the pig says, "I feed my children milk." And then the frog says, "Oh, is that so?" Well, that's when we learn the letter O. And then we go back through and we learn the letter A or A and so forth. And you keep going and you intermix the methods of meaning with the methods of phonics. And so by the time they're through with the first book or two, because their languages aren't a mess like English, some of the kids already know how to read. But you take 3 weeks on a book. So you have lots of time. Anyway, one of the activities that she taught us to do is when you do a book, you can do other activities that reinforce it. And so we have what's called Wawaya Edi Ahea, the children's drama. And we have puppet shows. And you see, I'm back in the back. I almost always wore a sweatband because I sweat the whole time I lived in New Guinea. Anyway, and I'm holding one puppet, somebody else is holding another one. And as the reader is reading the story, the characters from the story that we've made cutouts of are on sticks and they're performing the actions of the story. And there's a whole bunch of little characters there in that particular story, all doing their part together as they go. Now I'm going to come back out of this. We did lots and lots of literacy. Screen sharing has stopped. And I think that's about enough for that one. And I don't think I'll do a lot more on literacy tonight, but we probably have 200 or 300 literacy books that are, quote, in print. Meaning we printed them on silk screens or with computer printers or whatever means, depending on the era. And they've been put in people's hands. And we really could probably reprint over half of those again because they get worn out over time. But one of the things about this particular method, which is interesting, with these stiff covers on these books, you can hold the book so that the whole class can see it. And so you don't have to have 25 or 35 copies of the book for the kids to learn how to read. You have, say, 18 units in a year, and you have 18 copies of the book. And then the books that are finished, when their unit is over, those books are put in a little library where the kids can go back and practice them. But you don't have to have those thousands of books. Now, when we made big books, they really were this big, not this big. So you see, they're twice the size. So the kids you could have a lot of kids seeing the book from a great distance. But this one is a more detailed book, so the letters are smaller, so it doesn't illustrate that. But big books meant, what do you call it in American sizing? Folio size. So because of the combination of using dot matrix printers and silk screens with stencils like you used to use in school, you remember using stencils in school? You could print the books in the village with reasonably nice print, you know. And a lot of times we'd make the little books and people would say, where did you get those books made? Did you get them made in Australia, or did you get them made in Port Moresby, the capital? And we said, no, we made them at our house. You can come help. And they couldn't believe that you could make nice books right in your own place. And I had little kids when we started making the small ones, which were this size. I could sell them for the equivalent of 5 cents, which was back then 2 cents in their currency. And I'd have little kids come in, they'd bring in their little bits of money, and they'd come from a long ways, and they say, can I buy a book? And I say, yeah, how much money do you have? And they'd show me how much they have. And I said, well, you can buy 3 or 4 if you want. And they were just amazed that they had their own book for the first time. And how many books are piled up in our houses for our kids and grandkids? Gazillions. Yeah. But that was something really, really special when you could get a book. Now, I don't think I'm going to go on to the next topic unless you really want to.
I don't think we'd have time to get into another topic. I think it's time to start bringing it home for tonight.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. And how many people does it take to translate? I'm asking it slightly differently.
I see a lot of them holding up 2 fingers.
It probably takes 2, but not necessarily. If you happen to have that one superhero educated person who studied Greek and gone to seminary and the whole works and also knows his language perfectly, he might be able to do it by himself. But I, as the outsider, wouldn't be able to do that. You know, did I tell you about the little girl who said, Russ, you don't speak our language as well as I do? And she was 4 years old. And I said, no, I don't. And I never will, because she already had that head start at that age. So the outsider, what I find I do is I bring them back to what the text means, and I give suggestions as to what might work. And they say, oh, Russ, we know what you're trying to say, but you really say it like this. And if my suggestion won the day after, 4 or 5 hours of working, and one of my suggestions actually stayed without modification, I said, wow, I really did great that day. Because almost always they don't know a better way to do it than I do.
I did know with talking with Russ as we were setting this up, it was interesting when he was telling me about how cultures can affect that too. Do you want to tell him that story, if you remember off the top of your head, about the Japanese translator who was hearing the news stories?
Oh, yeah. The lady in that workshop, that Japanese lady, worked with 2 language groups setting up a curriculum for a whole year in their local languages, two neighboring languages. And part of what she did was taught them how to make these books, like I just showed you. And she wanted them to use their imaginations and write stories. And I think they probably picked up a handful of traditional stories from their culture, but mostly they just wrote stories, and she was really excited, and she came in back into our base, and she showed us these pictures, and I don't know if I have that story here or not, but she showed a picture of a mother chicken and her little chicks, and they were growing corn. And I read the story, and I had to try hard not to chuckle because the local people had gone to school in English, and it was a story of the little red hen. And then she showed me another one, and these two big birds were carrying a turtle between them, and they had a stick between their beaks, and the turtle was hanging on with his mouth to the stick. And I said, oh, what these people have done is that they've taken stories that they've learned in the English curriculum, Aesop's fables and fairy tales and stuff like that, and they've retold them, but because she's from Japanese culture, she doesn't know any of those stories, so she thinks they're stories from Papua New Guinea. But they were nice, and people liked them, and they used them. One of the stories that gets translated is Pilgrim's Progress, for instance. You know, so people can take stories from our cultures too. Okay, I think I'm at the sort of an ending point. We'll come back to my thing with the translation. We'll get more depth on that another time.
We have a couple minutes. Does anybody else want to ask Russ anything else?
If I didn't get all the way there on something, you know, bring it back up again, or put it in a note to David so we can make sure we hit it. So
Yeah, I think Mike unmuted. I think he might have something.
I do tend to get lost in the parentheses sometimes.
And like I said, with Russ, we're very fortunate. He could teach an entire college class on everything he gave you on that overview in the PowerPoint. So go ahead, Mike.
Well, you had said something about not being able to use abstract words like love and peace or those kinds of things. So it's awful difficult when you have a Bible full of love passages and love thy neighbor as thyself. How do you work around something that is so basic?
Yeah, our language area, they're very good at going back and forth between nouns and verbs, abstract nouns and actions. So we probably do it in some cases as well or better than English would, for some of them at least. I'm working on one in 2 Corinthians right now. The first chapter, beginning with the 3rd verse, I think it says that in essence, when it gets boiled down, it says, we partake of his suffering in order that we might in turn be able to help others and comfort them in their suffering. And the word comfort is the verb for what in John it talks about the Holy Spirit will come and he will be the other comforter. And in John, it's a name for the Holy Spirit, a descriptive of the Holy Spirit. And in 2 Corinthians, it's an action that we're supposed to do. Very, very interesting. Our language group can do that, but some language groups can only do it as the action. So it's not that you can't talk about the concept, but you can't say love is of God as a noun. You have to say doing love or being loving, doing love. Something, you have to make it into a verb somehow to make it work. And I think most Bible translators are pretty convinced of the fact that there's nothing in the Bible that can't be said, that needs to be said in order to translate it. Although there are some things that are sometimes done with a little bit of a go around. So for instance, the passage I was working on today was talking about what the Holy Spirit and ink. written with ink. I thought I had it sitting right here, but I don't. Anyway, we decided to just use the word ink because everybody learned the word ink in school. And if we have ways of talking about ink in the culture, but we decided to just use the one they learned in school. And probably atomic bomb, we would just say atomic bomb. Pronounce it their way.
One other question. You've obviously been working on your Bible translation for a long time. Where are you with the Bible, or have you completed the Bible for your people group, or how much more do you have to go, I guess I should say?
I could pull up the chart another day to show you guys, but I was just working with one of our consultants in P&G. He's trying to figure out what they need to have done next. And so I sent him the whole list of things, and he's made a nice chart for us. The New Testament, they have translated the whole New Testament, finished probably 5 or more years ago. And what my job has been is to go back and do what's called the exegetical or advisor checking. And so I compare what they've written down with what it's supposed to say. And so what do I have to do? I have to compare it with the Greek. I have to compare it with their dictionary. I have to compare it with the English versions that they were using as they were translating. And I compare it with the neighboring language versions that some of them knew and some of them may or may not have used, but I can refer to them for them. And so very often what I will do is I'll put that same verse up in 2 or 3 of the neighboring languages, and then I'll go back and forth and I'll look at what they said, and then I'll go back to the Greek and say, this is what the Greek says. Now, do any of these guys get close, or do they hit it on the nose, or what? And so I'd been doing, 2,000 verses a year when there were passages like the Gospels. And then when I got into Romans and Hebrews and stuff like that, I slowed down. I'm now doing 1,000 verses a year. And by the end of this year, I have to finish 2 Corinthians, James, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And then I'll have the whole New Testament ready for their next stage, which is, for a lot of the passages, it's checking with the community to see that what we all said as the translators really means what it's supposed to mean when they read it. And if you cross-check it against people who haven't helped, they can tell you whether you're all wet or not. But if you cross-check with one another, you say, oh, we know what it means because they've been working on it for days, right? And so of course they know what it means because they've been comparing all the versions and so forth and so on. But when they read it out loud in the community and people just stare at them with a blank look, and then they say, Beckham, which means give it back in Pidgin, and they give you something strange, then you know that they missed the boat. They missed the point of what they're translating. So that's the next big stage. And our friend in Papua New Guinea who's helping me get this set up, he's trying to get them through the final stages. And I don't know what percentage, hopefully this year, up to the stage where they're ready to publish. So I'll talk about that in more detail later, but there's a whole series of stages you have to go through.
All right, I think that's a good spot to stop. We'll take prayer requests in a minute. I do want to thank Russ for joining us. If you guys don't realize, he is on the West Coast, so he has a 3-hour time difference. It's probably getting to be about your dinner time, I'm guessing.
Oh, I eat a late lunch. And then I eat a small meal just before I go to bed, which is probably not a good policy, but that's when I eat it.
So I would say, I know this coronavirus time is not exactly what we would have chose, but I do think it's great that we've discovered this technology, and to be able to talk to an expert like Russ, I think is pretty cool. So think of your questions. We've only got them one more Wednesday. So think of some good stuff. I know he's got a lot of good stuff for us. Do you want to say anything else, Russ?
Yeah, I need to tell Pastor David that you know that an expert is just a drip under pressure. So
I wanted to ask a couple cultural questions, but there's not time tonight, so
Write them down for next week.
I already
Yeah,
know
or-
what I want.
Or you can pop them to Pastor David, and then he can send them off to me if there's something.
No, that's all right. It's not. I mean,
Any way we want to do it, we can do it. So
Yeah, either way is fine, Neil. If you want, you can message me, or you can just save it if you won't forget it.
I don't like to get messages secondhand. I want to talk right to the horse's mouth.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording so we can get to our